Hi and welcome back. So in this video, we'll make a conclusion of section 13.1, which we're looking at in the previous video, where we examined the short-run response of output and unemployment to the increase in productivity. So we said using the aggregate demand aggregate supply model, in the case where there is an increase in productivity from A to A with an apostrophe, the impact of that on output, unemployment, and employment would depend on how the increase in productivity shifts the AS and the AD model. So we said the increase in productivity would decrease the amount of labor needed to produce the unit of output, and therefore reducing the cost for firms, and that is on the aggregate supply side, which will then lead to firms to reduce prices they charge at any level of output, and hence the shift downwards of the AS curve from AS to this new point of aggregate supply. However, from the AD curve, would the increase in productivity increase or decrease the demand for goods at a given price level? So the answer is not straightforward, because productivity increase do not appear out of nowhere or in a vacuum. So what happens to aggregate demand depends on what triggers the increase in productivity in the first place. And in the previous video, we explained two basic triggers and said trigger one is if the increase in productivity comes from the widespread implementation of a measure invention, the aggregate demand will shift to the right and output would increase, as shown by this arrow here. But in a case where the growth comes from efficient use of existing technology, then this means firms will have to reorganize production, and reorganization of production may require little or new investment. So in this case, we might find a case where there's increase in uncertainty and job security worries may force workers to reduce their consumption and even save more. And on the production side, we might see firms being reluctant to invest and actually spending less on labor. So we said even if we assume the more favorable case and assume that there is an increase in productivity, shifts or rather increases the equilibrium output from Y here to the new Y upwards, meaning that the increase in productivity has shifted the AS curve downwards from AS to AS and has shifted the AD upwards from AD to AD, thereby increasing output at a given level of prices. Then, even in this case, we still cannot tell what happens to employment without having more information. So what happens to employment depends on whether output increases proportionately more or less than A. This is from the narrative that labor is given by the ratio between output and productivity. So what we're trying to explain is that the impact of A on labor would depend on whether the increase in productivity A is complemented by the increase or not of output. So for N not to decrease, these two need to increase at the same rate. So the rate of productivity must be complemented by the rate of productivity. Let's make a conclusion on this. So what we just explained is that even when there is a favor shift in aggregate demand curve, we are still not sure of the full effect. So if you may recall, equation 13.2, which says labor is equals to the ratio of output and productivity. We can, from this equation, we can deduce that when the equation is represented in natural log, for instance, the change in employment, this one, which is change in n, is equals to the change in output minus change in productivity, such that labor will only not be affected by the change in productivity if the two are equal. That is, change in output is equals to the change in the productivity. Okay, so the effect on employment following technological progress is therefore dependent on whether the increase in output is proportionately more or less than the increase in productivity. So without the information about the size of the shift and the slope of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve, we are unable to figure out the full extent of productivity increases. So in the short run, therefore, the effect of productivity increase on employment and unemployment is not clear or difficult to figure out. So this is also confirmed by existing empirical evidence in the subject. So this figure here plots the behavior of the labor of productivity and the behavior of output for the South African non-agricultural sector from 1970 to 1920. So basically, this figure basically shows that instead of a relationship that we're trying to look at or trying to see of the impact of productivity on output, it shows that the relationship is the other way around. Output growth affects productivity instead of productivity affecting output growth. This figure shows that output growth leads to higher productivity growth. So the reason is that in bad times, firms are usually hard laborers. They keep more workers than is necessary for current production. So when demand for goods increase for any reason, firms respond partly by increasing employment and partly by having the current employed workers work even harder. So by increasing, by forcing laborers to produce more in times of demand, it seems as if there's an increase. It then increases productivity. So because of the high demand, productivity increases, not that because of productivity, demand increases and therefore output increases. This can be seen by the fact that whenever there is a slight spike up in output growth, in the output growth curve, it's followed by an even larger increase in the curve of the productivity growth. So this is the conclusion that we make from the empirical evidence, that there is a strong positive relationship between output growth and productivity growth, and not vice versa. Two, there are instances where the positive relationship doesn't hold, especially in the middle of the noughties in South Africa. That is in the middle of the 2000s, where there's a lot of zeros or noughts. And lastly, empirical research outcomes regarding the effects of productivity increase is as unuseful or unhelpful as the theory that we covered with the AS and the AD model. So in the short run, an increase in productivity may or may not lead to an increase in unemployment. So the answer is unclear. So in the next video, we'll look at the medium run and see how productivity affect output and unemployment in the medium run. Thank you.